the world central bankers are all waiting with bated breath, hoping that the Fed can engineer a global recession. So if the Fed can engineer a global recession, then none of those countries need to necessarily administer the bitter medicine.
Hello everyone, I'm Giorgio and you're watching Avanguardia Investment Media. Today we are very fortunate to be joined by Michael Cao to talk about the US dollar. Michael, thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Great. So let's jump into it. You recently co-wrote and presented a paper entitled US dollar primacy in an era of economic warfare. Could you explain to the audience the main ideas behind this paper?
Sure. Thank you for having me. So this is a paper that I co-wrote and I co-presented along with my collaborator, Lieutenant Commander Mike St. Pierre of the Royal Canadian Navy. We presented it on February 9th at West Point at the symposium on the great power competition between the US and China specifically. And so this was meant to be a policy paper targeted toward our policymakers to educate them and to hopefully maybe even influence national policy. That's the hope of the paper. So the idea here is that the role of the U.S. dollar as a global reserve currency is a critical one to what we call the U.S. led rules-based order that is increasingly coming under attack or challenge by adversaries to the West, namely China, right? And there's this notion, which we believe is mistaken, that the rules-based order set up by the Bretton Woods Agreement in 1944 is a 100% a top-down construct, almost like a Trojan horse mechanism, where hey, we get everybody to use the U.S. dollar after World War II. And tell everybody that the dollar is going to be backed by gold. And then in 1971, there's a big rug pull that we call the Nixon shock, where he abandons gold convertibility, and then the world of true fiat currencies are born, right? That's sort of the conventional narrative, but we reject that in the paper because when you look at the actual history of the rise of Eurodollar banking, for instance, which started occurring after the failure of the tripartite agreement, and specifically the catalyst of Great Britain, which at that point had the status of global reserve currency. When Great Britain imposed capital controls in their own domestic fight against inflation in 1957, you saw a sort of bottom-up evolutionary adoption of the dollar well beyond its gold convertibility, if you will, well beyond US borders at that point. And so the first part of our paper explores, okay, well, if the trust in the dollar isn't explicitly or wasn't explicitly based on pure gold convertibility, as many people would have you believe, what was it based on? And so we posit that that trust ultimately comes from national power. What defines national power? There are many, many sort of military academy frameworks for defining different pillars of national power. In our paper, we focus on what we call the economic pillars of national power. Geography is an important one that informs everything, but we mainly focus on the twin pillars of natural resource availability, as well as industrial policy. And we highlight how, but we choose two different industries, the semiconductor industry and the oil and gas industry, both of which were pioneered initially by the United States, but because of our sort of capitalist free market system, and also because of other exogenous circumstances, both of these in both of these industries, we've ceded leadership, right? So in both chips and oil and gas. Now, the interesting thing here is that the our administrations are finally recognizing the importance of the semiconductor supply chains, and we're coming belatedly to that recognition and adopting what I call industrial policies that are actually aligned to our geostrategic interests in that regard. With targeted export controls, with the CHIPS Act, et cetera. But and that's coming in an industry where the United States still has very, very commanding choke points within that supply chain. If you compare and contrast it to oil and gas, though, this is an example where our policies are horribly misaligned to our geostrategic interests. In the world of oil and gas, the United States is still the leading producer in the world, and yet, because of this blind adoption to ESG policies, without considering externalities, and also, um, uh, I would say, mistakenly ascribing Moore's law dynamics to the world of molecules versus bits. Um, a lot of our policies, like for instance, draining the SPR, canceling the Keystone Pipeline, threatening windfall profits taxes, threatening export bans. These are policies and rhetoric that are directly undermining an area where the U.S. has a very, very natural advantage. And so, anyways, so this second part of our paper is talking about how we really first need to do no harm on ourselves with respect to energy policy, and try to align some of our industrial policies with those of our geostrategic interests. Now, we also talk about sanctions. So when people talk about weaponization of the dollar, it's mainly through financial sanctions, like the seizure of foreign exchange reserves against hostiles like Russia. Right now, our paper. It's beyond the scope of our paper to talk about whether or not that's the right thing to do or not. But it's happened, and it's also a fact that over the last several administrations, I think U.S. foreign policy has over relied on financial sanctions, which in turn only have teeth because of the primacy of the U.S. dollar. It's also a fact that when you over rely on sanctions, it naturally drives our adversaries to look for alternatives, right? So we maintain that ultimately the dollar's status as global reserve currency is a game that is the United States to lose. It's very, very going to be very, very difficult for an upstart like China with the yuan to force the dollar out of that role. However, the point of this paper was to encourage some out of the box thinking and say, hey, there are alternatives to overt weaponization of the dollar through excessive use of sanctions. Number one is we need to protect our flank by adopting aligned industrial policies. And number two, it just so happens that we find ourselves in this interesting macroeconomic window where we are fighting a domestic war against inflation, as are most countries. But the United States economy is proving more resilient than the economies of most other economic blocs. And so the last part of our paper is talking about how a strong dollar policy, right, which has the twin benefit of combating domestic inflation, can be used to basically apply economic pressure on countries like China, where China, for instance, is is still reeling from its Evergrande property crisis, is reeling from the multiple years of quixotic zero COVID policies, and they're forced to continue to stimulate their economy, even though their economy is super, super levered compared to the United States. So a strong dollar policy is that's the reason why I call it a dollar wrecking ball, is because when you have a currency that has such widespread adoption as the US dollar, where 90% of FX transactions are US dollar denominated, commodities of the world are invoiced in US dollars. If you have a situation now where the world is lurching towards an energy crisis potentially, and there is a strong dollar, well, it's going to be very, very difficult for a country like China that imports 80 to 90% of its oil to navigate that crisis without having inflicting some real economic hardship on themselves. So the PB, I don't know if maybe I should pause and then you can ask some questions, but that's basically the gist of the paper. We cover a lot of ground. It's a long paper, so thank you for taking the time to read it.
It was a very interesting paper, and I think a lot of policymakers in the US should read it because, yes, I agree with you. The US dollar is here to stay, and it's probably going to be mistakes by the US that threaten the US dollar in the future and not actions by other countries, as you said. Now, talking about the US dollar wrecking ball, in the paper you say it is much cheaper to sow chaos than to defend against it. So what do you think is the ultimate goal here and why do you think in this economic warfare it's such a powerful weapon to use the US dollar instead of other means?
Again, I want to differentiate between when most people say weaponization of the US dollar, they're talking about the use of sanctions whereby dollar-based reserves are seized. Whereas my use of the weaponization of the dollar is simply to say, I'm actually discouraging the overt use of sanctions, but saying, hey, we have now a macroeconomic window in which a strong dollar accomplishes multiple goals with one stone, kills multiple birds with one stone. We have a domestic inflation issue that we need resolving. And the way to export that inflation is through a strong dollar. Or at the minimum, I should maybe couch it as avoiding an explicit weak dollar policy, right? So if you think about the last several years, like since COVID, you want to talk about the insults that we've piled on the dollar ourselves, right? Which is excessive expansion of the federal balance sheet and excessive money printing, right? And so even with that excessive weak dollar policy, the DXY never got below essentially 89, 90. And so with the DXY recently hitting a high of nearly 115 and retrenching back to like 105, I would say that the dollar is obviously much stronger than it was during our excessive weak dollar policy, but I wouldn't say that the dollar is excessively strong here. Right? Excessively strong would be when you go back to like the 1984 Plaza Accords when the DXY equivalent hit something like 165. Now that would be something, right? I think it comes down to that, the economic reality right now is that there are very, very few regional blocks that can compete. So if you just take the UK for example, or the Bank of Japan or the ECB or the PBOC. Well, first of all, the PBOC and the Bank of Japan are both. Yesterday, I tweeted out. I think they're both flogging dead horses, meaning they're moribund economies, right? They're both central banks there are actively easing still, even as the Fed is not quite done hiking. The ECB and the BOE are also in a bit of a bind, to be honest, because I think in both of those regions, I think Mother Nature had a lot to do with the central banks being even as hawkish as they've been so far, right? Everybody was very, very concerned about a brutal winter and the lack of Russian gas. And then basically what happened was Mother Nature was kind, and Europe has generally been granted a respite this year. But if this conflict continues, I think next year could be a real challenge. So, so I think it's interesting that when I read through the tea leaves of central bankers and their tough rhetoric of keeping pace with the Fed, you've seen tough talk out of Lagarde. You've seen previous tough talk come out of Bailey. But when you actually see the actions, right, they've been very, very tepid in their actions, and they've been very, very behind the Fed. What I think is happening is the world central bankers are all waiting with bated breath, hoping that the Fed can engineer a global recession. So if the Fed can engineer a global recession, then none of those countries need to necessarily administer the bitter medicine, right? Well, the Fed is administering the bitter medicine. Um, and already you've got the UK economy slowing down to near zero. But the difficulty that the other central bankers face is that the U.S. economy is still humming along and extremely resilient. And so the our paper is recognizing that right now there so with our allies, though, right, we have bilateral currency swaps that help mitigate some of the fallout from a strong dollar, right? But China is going to be under some real pressure, and the real tell, by the way, that they're concerned about it is in Q4 of last year when the dollar wrecking ball was spiking towards 115, right? If you remember, and the yuan I think crested 7.1 or something like that. You saw concerted intervention by the PBOC to strengthen the yuan. Now, why would the PBOC do that in an export-driven economy, right? You would think that they would welcome a weaker yuan, but they did the opposite. And to me, that's a big tell on their fear of the economic chaos that I talk about that would ensue if you had the twin specter of rising commodity prices as well as a weakening yuan. So they have, their way of combating that has always been that it's kind of like a soft dollar peg, but they have capital controls, right? And I think for the folks that continually preach about how the yuan, sorry, the PBOC is laying the scaffolding to overtake the dollar. They've already established six bilateral currency swaps with like 60 countries, et cetera, et cetera. Well, I got news for you. I mean, until they free up their capital account and make their currency fully convertible, they have no shot. They absolutely have no shot at supplanting the U.S. dollar. And the minute they make their capital account freely convertible, I think you might see double digits on the yuan. You will see a massive depreciation because there's so much pent up pressure for even the locals to get their assets out of the country. So I think it's gonna, they're walking a tightrope.
Right. And something I really found very interesting in your paper, and you mentioned it earlier, is the unique position of the US being a country that doesn't rely heavily on exports. So it can actually have a very strong currency and it can help fight inflation domestically without hurting the economy, because the economy doesn't rely heavily on exports. And at the same time, the economy is structurally very strong at withstanding higher interest rates. I've seen in your paper, for example, you mentioned the variable rates mortgages that are very common in some places in Europe
That's
and
right.
in Canada or in other places. So it's very unique how the US is positioned to be able to actually follow this very strong dollar policy.
Right, right. I mean, I think I can think of four critical charts that we put up in our paper, right? You already mentioned two of them. One is that the U.S. is very export independent, right? And most people would say that that's a weakness, right? Because it's resulted in a persistent trade deficit. But in this case, it's actually a strength. Um, uh, and again, a very, very low percentage of variable rate mortgages, very low household income, very low household, sorry, high income to debt ratios, right? Relatively high income to debt ratios, or low debt to income ratios, I should say. And then what was the fourth chart that I'm thinking about? Oh, just from a balance sheet perspective, what the federal balance, what the central bank's balance sheets look like as a percentage of GDP. Even though the Fed, even after the Fed embarked on this massive amount of, super QE the last several years, our balance sheet is the least burdened of the G4, at around 34% of GDP versus, say, Japan at like close to 120%. And ECB obviously is something, I think, around 60% or something like that. So it's an interesting um, macroeconomic window. That's basically the observation that we're making.
Sure. And would it safe to say that we could expect a stronger dollar, or at least you expect a stronger dollar moving forward in the next years? Of course, we have seen this pullback from late last year to today. But what is your, let's say, if you had to guess what's going to happen?
I wrote a thread a couple of months ago called "Who's Going to Outhawk the Fed," highlighting a lot of these points that we put into our paper. That the different regions, and I also wrote another thread, I think back in October or December of last year, I can't remember, I called it geopolitical mosh pits. And the idea here is that when you've got a world that's racked by inflation, a structural inflation, right? It becomes very, very difficult for even the Fed to act as sort of the world central banker and watch out for everybody's interests, because ultimately domestic interests must come first. And so it becomes a sort of every man for himself dynamic in the world of central banks. In August, or no, June, or between June and August of last year, when the yen first started approaching around the 145 mark, a friend who has some high place connections at the Fed mentioned to me that there were rumors that the BOJ and the Fed had essentially agreed to allow the BOJ to acquire U.S. 10 years on our behalf, basically, right? To paint a picture of essentially, lower yields and stymie the advance of the dollar at that point. And so, if you remember, what then happened was it stopped the yen depreciation dead in its tracks, and then what followed was a massive bear market rally here. A couple weeks later, that same friend called up and said, "Hey, I'm getting the signal that It sounds like we can't really hold the line anymore. We got to just kind of let it go. Then you saw the yen spike all the way to 150, and then all hell broke loose here, right? From you had the big risk off after that. So I see a bit of that dynamic going forward because the reason the dollar retrenched as hard as it did, I think, is just simply because everybody is fixated on the second derivative slowing, that the pace of Fed hikes is going to start slowing down, and and that the other central banks need catching up to do. My issue, though, with that is that, first of all, we don't know when the Fed is truly going to reach its terminal rate yet. You know, even if the Fed reached its terminal rate, we don't know how long they're going to stay there. But I'm willing to bet that it's going to be longer, higher for longer than what almost any other central bank out there can handle. I go back to what I said earlier about how everybody is hoping that the Fed can do their job for them on a global basis. But you've got different constraints in different countries. With the UK, they had a guilt crisis already, last year because of their overlevered pension system. With the ECB has this very unwieldy transmission, this TPI mechanism to try to keep sovereign spreads together. And they don't even really have a pan-European bond market. So I think Lagarde's job is infinitely harder than the Fed's. And then Japan, of course, is in this very, very difficult to exit yield curve control situation. And yesterday I recalled that same thread that I wrote, that geopolitical mosh pit thread that talks about how Japan in a way is kind of a guinea pig here because when the Bank of Japan owns about 80% of its JGBs, what happens? What is the end game exactly, right? How do they really get out of that? Can they can they universally just cancel their debt? And then if they cancel their debt, what happens? What I think happens is that you will see a Weimar type of collapse in the yen because I don't believe in free lunches. I think that at the end of the day, if a sovereign needs to restructure like that, it again comes back down to a country's economic pillars and geographical assets and what what underlies the currency strength in the first place.
So Michael, thank you so much for taking the time to be here today. I'm sure the audience will love this interview and you've been very kind with your time. Now, before we finish, where should people go to read the paper? I'm sure I'll put the link down below, but if they want to follow you more closely, where should they go?
Sure, I'm at Urban Cowboy, KAO boy on Twitter, but because of a unexpected Twitter suspension in January, I decided to start putting my longer form content on Substack. So it's urbancowboy.substack.com.
Perfect. Thank you.